The coronavirus pandemic has raised fundamental questions about the future of the world's biggest cities, as lockdowns, social distancing and remote working have battered economies reliant on constant human interaction. In early 2020, New York was one of the earliest to be hit, all but shutting down as commuters and tourists stayed away and businesses closed. Now it's starting to recover, but will things ever be the same again? Bob Abeshouse, a lifetime resident, has been finding out.
The threat to New York posed by COVID-19 is far less than it was a year ago when the city was the global epicenter of death and illness from the virus. Today, about 4 million of the city's 8.5 million residents have been fully vaccinated against COVID. Mayor Bill de Blasio expects New York to fully reopen for business this summer.
We all are going to get ready for a new world, a world of more freedom, because we've earned it by getting vaccinated.
But hundreds of thousands have already fled New York, and those who stayed know that bringing it back won't be easy. Like other global cities, New York is facing immense challenges as a result of the coronavirus. New York is my home, so I set out there to investigate the impact of the pandemic on major cities and what's needed to restore their vitality. First stop, Times Square, New York's crossroads in Midtown Manhattan. Before COVID-19 hit, about 400,000 tourists and commuters mingled here each day. The daily traffic now is only about 135,000.
Hello, how are you?
Good. And Jayasiri helps run this souvenir store and is also a wholesaler of merchandise to other shops.
How's business?
It's been very bad since last year. In my block, I'm the only one who's open. 80% our business depends on the international tourists. So without them, it's so hard to survive, you know.
New York, the leading urban tourism destination in the U.S., had 13.5 million international visitors in 2019. Tourism provided some $7 billion in tax revenue and more than 400,000 jobs.
In my wholesale business, about 30% of my customers have already closed because they couldn't hang in there.
Are the rents expensive here?
It is. It's very expensive. Small store can pay like from $40,000, and the biggest shops close to $200,000 a month.
Wow, that's an enormous sum. How much is your business dependent on Broadway, on the shows?
I think people come to New York to see the sights and to go to a Broadway show. You know, after each show, I have a lot of customers coming into the store. So Broadway shows are so important to us.
But the lights on Broadway have been off since March 2020, when the city shut down to combat the coronavirus.
At 3:30 on a normal Wednesday, the street would be full of people.
When do you think Broadway's going to come back to that level?
You know, I don't really know for sure.
Kate SHINDLE has performed in several Broadway shows and is president of the Actors Equity Union.
It's been really devastating. We went from record employment in 2019 to 100% unemployment in 2020.
In 2019, Broadway was responsible for $15 billion of the city's economy and 95,000 jobs.
Broadway contributes more to New York's economy than all of the professional sports teams combined. For every person an audience member sees on stage, there are probably a dozen people you don't see who are working on the show as well.
What's it like to be cut off from doing the thing you love?
Artists, I believe, have an internal engine that's constantly telling them to create, create, create. It's a big part of what makes New York, New York. There's a real hunger to get back to doing what we do.
Many Broadway theaters have announced plans to reopen in September, but it remains to be seen if enough people will come to revive the industry. For shows to be profitable, all the seats must be filled.
It's not for the faint-hearted, because the margins can be very tight.
My sense is businesses in sectors like tourism and the arts, they will start to rebound, but they're not going to be like they were before.
James PARROTT is an economist at the New School Center for New York City Affairs. He focuses on the labor market and workforce policies.
New York's been hit hard economically by the Depression, the fiscal crisis of the 70s, 9/11. How do you compare the economic challenges New York City's facing today to those in the past?
Well, it's far greater than anything we've seen since the 1930s. More than 1 million jobs were lost. And when we get to the end of 2021, we will still be down 300,000 to 400,000 jobs in New York City.
So you think New York is really facing a jobs crisis?
Absolutely. New York City's job loss is 2.5 times the job loss around the country. And the COVID pandemic impact has been largely concentrated on the face-to-face service job. The people who occupy these jobs, largely people of color. 80% of the job loss is in that sector. And only, like 6% of higher paying jobs have been affected by this. So it's really much more lopsided than anything we've seen before.
Manhattan experienced 2/3 of the city's job loss because it is the center of service sector jobs connected both to tourism and office work.
There are 1.2 million office workers in New York City. That supports a lot of daytime economic activity in restaurants and retail, barbershops, nail salons. Only about 10 to 15% of those office workers have come back. And 2 years from now, 100% won't be back because there will be a permanent increase in people working from home.
You come up here, and here you are standing over all of New York City.
One real estate titan forced to reckon with the impact of the pandemic on both tourism and office workers is Anthony Malkin, the chairman and CEO of the company that owns the iconic Empire State Building.
You can see new development to the north and Midtown and beyond. You can see everything that's occurring down to the south. This is never going away. This can only come back.
Before the pandemic, how many tourists would normally be here on a day?
On a slow day, about 5,700, and on our busy day, we max out at 24,000. Now, as we've publicly disclosed, about what we'd see on a slow day, we see in a week.
Malkin's Empire State Realty Trust also owns 12 other commercial properties in New York City. Office space available to rent in Manhattan is at an all-time high.
I don't think we see the bottom until the end of the first quarter of 22, and we rebuild from there.
Some Wall Street analysts say that commercial real estate is facing an existential crisis.
If you're not well capitalized right now, are you in danger in this particular environment right now over the next 18 to 24 months and the past 12? Absolutely. Will we come out of this? Yes. One of the things we have, Bob, in our portfolio is a focus on energy efficiency and indoor environmental quality. In March, we had the highest number of tours of office space that we have seen since the pandemic.
Vacancies have been driving rents down on both the office and retail side.
Until we actually see the tourists return, there'll be certain elements of retail that simply will not come back. Also, the issues of the neighborhood shops around the office worker areas of New York City. Where, to be blunt, if the office workers aren't there, they have no customer.
In a recent survey, just 22% of New York's largest employers expect their workers to work full-time from offices in the future. What impact do you think that's going to have on commercial real estate in New York?
I think truly that the surveys actually have begun to change, and over the next 18 to 24 months, we'll see where we actually are. And I think people will have to experiment what it does to teams, what it does to onboarding new team members, and where the smartest upcoming individuals want to be.
The best we can gauge is that remote work was about 5 to maybe 10% of the workforce before the pandemic. That surely looks like it's going to grow to about 20%. So it's going to double. Part-time remote is going to be more.
Richard Florida is the author of several bestsellers on urban policy and a professor at the University of Toronto's School of Cities.
The big impact of the pandemic is not about who's going to move to the suburb and who's going to move to this rural area. We now know that a lot of that's been overblown. The big impact is on the office districts. There, I think, looking forward, you could project a 20 to 30% decline in office occupancy.
You've written that the impact of the pandemic on central business districts is as great a challenge as deindustrialization was in the past. What do you mean?
If you look at this skyline behind me, that was originally built up as a place to pack and stack office workers. Before we had computers, digital technology could share on the internet. It was like a factory for information processing. What's happening now is, I think, this year-long experiment in the pandemic has shown us that people no longer need to work that way.
Do you think part of the solution is to convert office towers into affordable housing?
Yeah, I think the point is, how do we remake these office districts in ways that are not only just better economically, but more inclusive and better for a broader range of people? And we have to convert office towers and hotels and these residential luxury buildings that they thought were going to be built for the plutocratic class.
Skinny condo towers for the wealthy now loom half empty over the city. Meanwhile, more than 200 hotels are shuttered, according to the head of the Hotel Association of New York, VIJAY DANDAPANI.
The hotel business fell off a precipice in March of last year, and it really hasn't recovered. The real occupancy is between 15 and 20% on average for the whole city.
The return of office workers is even more important than tourism to reopening hotels.
Business travelers absolutely pay the most money. Tourists, stay and we value their business, but they simply don't pay the same dollar rate.
When do you think the hotel industry is going to recover here in New York?
Not before 2025, because that's how long it takes for conventions, conferences to come back. Our estimate is 20% of the inventory of New York hotels is just going to go away either to other uses or be torn down completely and be rebuilt as something else.
Some 5,000 of the city's 25,000 eating and drinking establishments have already gone away, and thousands more are barely hanging on. At Grand Central Station, the flow of office commuters that restaurants and other small businesses depend on has dropped 75%.
How does this compare to what it was like before the pandemic?
It's a ghost town. This place would be mobbed, people waiting for trains.
Sandy INGBER is the executive chef at the Oyster Bar, a legendary seafood restaurant and watering hole at Grand Central that hopes to reopen soon.
Why are places like the Oyster Bar so important to the vitality of New York? I mean, when you're in this restaurant and it's full up, what does it feel like?
It's an amazing feeling. It's loud, it's busy, and we have a lot of happy people. It's something about New York, it's a real food town. I mean, there's so many foodies here. Restaurants are a very, very important employer in New York City. And the chain of supplies it affects, from meat, dairy, vegetables, everything that a restaurant has to purchase, and down the line, it has affected everybody.
Last September, the Oyster Bar tried to reopen at 25% capacity, the state limit at the time.
And after 8 days, it just wasn't sustainable. 2% revenue out of 25% capacity.
How concerned are you about the change in work habits and remote work in terms of the survival of the restaurant?
It's number one on my mind. How long will it take to be back to normal, and will it ever be?
Outside the office districts, restaurants have done better. Those that managed to stay open survived by expanding takeout and offering dining in newly permitted outside areas. Vaccination, the easing of inside seating limits, and warm weather have increased business. But most places are still serving fewer customers than before the pandemic, according to the New York City Hospitality Alliance. The president of the group is the owner of a restaurant in Harlem, MELBA Wilson.
Open streets, outdoor seating was a lifeline. And you can eat your way through any culture, any diverse culture around the world if you eat at the 5 boroughs in New York.
If you go around now, there's so much eating that's on outside. Has New York become Paris in that regard? Is that going to be one of the things that stays from the pandemic, do you think?
Oui. I do see a little Paris here in New York, and I'm loving it.
So are you becoming profitable again, or?
Profitable? I don't think I'll be there for a while because of the losses that we incurred. We've had a lot of closures, so we've lost quite a few. We're struggling. We are struggling. There are a lot of vacant storefronts in this city. But, at this point, I'm happy to say we're hiring more people. We are putting people back to work. That's what's important.
In the decade before COVID-19, restaurants and bars were the main source of employment for less educated workers in New York. Today, there are 135,000 fewer of these jobs.
What's been the impact on workers from the difficulties the restaurant industry has faced?
A lot of them, for the first time, have found themselves at food pantries, at food banks. And a lot of them have found themselves on welfare for the first time. You have so many people dealing with mental illnesses as well as homelessness. So the impact that it's had on our industry and on our people is devastating.
And it's also been devastating in terms of illness and death. People of color in the city were twice as likely as whites to be hospitalized from COVID-19 and 1.5 times more likely to die.
We referred to this as a new strain of inequality. So compounding the long-standing economic inequality associated with wage and wealth disparities, the pandemic hit hardest at people of color.
One neighborhood hit hard by COVID-19 is Flushing, Queens, which has a large Asian and Latino population, many of them undocumented immigrants. Elmhurst Hospital, which had one of the highest death rates in the city last year, is just a few miles from this food pantry.
Dear God, thank you very much for the food that you have given us today.
Pedro Rodriguez and his organization La Jornada run the food bank.
When the pandemic hit, people were coming from everywhere. We call it a tsunami. We were not ready for it. But at the end of the year, we were serving close to 11,000 families.
Is it only Queens where you'd see food lines like this?
No, you can see them everywhere in New York. The need is incredible.
You help a lot of immigrants. Where are they from?
They are from everywhere. We have like 14 different languages spoken in this line alone. You know, thousands of people were sick in this community and no work, no food. And I see them suffer like nobody had suffered before this year.
Immigrants make up almost half of New York City's workforce.
What are the jobs that people were doing before COVID? People that are coming to this pantry.
This is the people who took care of you in your restaurant. This is the people who took care of you in your laundromat. Every kind of service industry that you had was taken away.
I used to work in the hotel industry. I've been out of work for a year now.
Are you going to be able to go back to your work?
They pretty much terminated the whole staff. So from the way it looks, they're not going to hire us back.
What kind of work were you doing before COVID hit?
做餐馆的，因为餐馆都关掉了，很多餐馆都关掉了，很多人都在家里不敢出来吃饭啊。
Yo tengo trabajo antes aquí, pues en construcción, restaurante y cualquier cosa.
Have the programs that provided by the government, have you been able to access them at all?
Yo nunca recibo ninguna ayuda de gobierno. Yo pago taxes, todos los taxes de muchos años. Estamos pagando, pero ningún tipo de ayuda.
Soon after we went to the food bank, the New York State Legislature passed a $2.5 billion excluded workers fund to help undocumented immigrants with food and rent. But difficulties in accessing the money remain.
Whether we're talking about food security or about small business help to get people through this period, there's a wide band of social services that need to be strengthened.
Thomas Daja is the author of the recently released book, New York, New York, New York. It examines the city's history from its flirt with bankruptcy in the 1970s to the 2000s under former Mayor Michael Bloomberg.
Immigrants have really saved the city in these 40 years. Without the vast wave of immigration over that time, we would not have done what we did here.
About 300,000 people left New York because of the pandemic. But since the 1970s, the city has attracted a steady flow of immigrants. Today, it is estimated that around 3 million New Yorkers were born in another country.
If we're talking about a few 100,000 people moving or leaving, we can absorb that. There were under 7 million people in 1978, and now we're talking about 8.5. So whether we're talking about restaurants or hip hop or real estate agents, these are people who came from all parts of the world and contributed immensely to the city and really recharged it. It led to blocks of rubble being turned into housing again and neighborhoods coming back, crime going down. They played major roles.
Concern about crime is rising again. In 2020, the city recorded 462 murders, an increase of 45%. And shootings have surged, similar to what has happened in other American cities during the pandemic.
What we're looking at today is serious and real and deadly, but it is still nothing compared to where the city has been in the past, where you had, 2,200 people a year being murdered. So I think we are well within our ability to control it.
Crime is also up on the subway system, due in part to the steep drop in ridership from the pandemic. The subway is critical to the city's recovery, and earlier this year, it faced cuts in service of up to 40% due to reduced revenue. But President Biden's American Rescue Plan provided $6.5 billion to keep the subway running at full strength through 2024.
Help is on the way. This is the most significant piece of legislation in so many ways in decades.
Championed by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who hails from Brooklyn, The rescue package allocated $100 billion to New York State and its residents. Many cities around the world face major revenue shortfalls as a result of the pandemic. Luckily for New York, Democrats are in control in Washington and can provide much-needed funds. The Biden administration is now pushing for a $2 trillion infrastructure bill, which would provide additional money for the city.
It's the single largest investment in American jobs since World War II.
President Biden's American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan that he's put forward, is absolutely critical to our recovery.
KATHRYN WYLDE is the president and CEO of the Partnership for New York, which represents many of the city's largest companies. In 2019, led by the financial sector, New York City comprised 10% of the entire U.S. economy.
The New York economy is absolutely critical to the United States, and we are the gateway to the global economy for the American economy in many, many respects.
Do you think the pandemic could change that?
I don't think the pandemic changes New York's role in the economy. I think that we can, with our public policies, change it. So New York has moved politically far to the left, and we've had major tax increases. When people have been working remotely, that can in fact have a major discouragement factor for bringing talent back to the workplace, particularly in the financial services industry.
Shouldn't the wealthy and those who are doing better be willing to make more of a contribution to the recovery of the city?
Absolutely, and they're doing that both through their taxes and through their philanthropic contributions. But there was a decision to make the rich pay more. It's become sort of a class warfare. And that's not how New York City has worked in the past. It's not what's going to drive our recovery.
Thank you, New York. Let's move the city.
But addressing inequality exacerbated by the pandemic is a central theme of the New York City mayor's race that is currently underway.
I'm KATHRYN Garcia. I want this city to work for every family.
The impact of COVID-19, along with protests connected to the George Floyd killing, have created new pressures for change.
We're facing a crisis unlike anything we've ever seen before. But with the right leadership, we will rise up again.
A June primary will decide the candidates for the November general election. The Democratic nominee will likely become mayor in one of the most consequential campaigns in New York's history.
The city is terribly divided. It's divided by class, it's divided by race, it's divided by where people live. And I think New York needs a mayor who's going to pull the city together and can be a mayor of everybody.
What do you think the next mayor should focus on in terms of the city's recovery?
We need to bring people back to work. That's the number one thing. We need to bring the tourists back. We need to welcome people who spend money, who provide the jobs, that allow taxes to be collected, people to pay their rent, put food on the tables. We need to be welcoming.
A lot of these jobs are not going to come back. And because of the pandemic, technology is more important, e-commerce is more important. The challenge that New York City is facing now is commensurate with what the city faced after World War II, where tens of thousands of people from the military service re-entered civilian jobs. And we should be planning for that and putting in place the training programs to make sure that we don't have a prolonged and deep unemployment crisis.
Merchants in our neighborhood are coming to us and said, listen, I'm behind more than 6 months that they can pay.
Thousands of small businesses and hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers are also facing eviction. A state eviction moratorium expires on August 31st.
You compared it last year to a tsunami.
Yes.
Has the tsunami passed?
No, we're still under the water. The jobs are not here. People are behind the rent. And I hope that vaccination will create work for all these people. And if that happens, then we will come out okay.
Vaccination is changing life in New York by the day. At a recent pro basketball game, fans had to prove they'd been vaccinated or had a recent COVID test to get in. 15,000 felt safe enough to crowd together again in the stands.
Some people say that New York won't come back until Broadway comes back, and Broadway won't come back until New York comes back.
Yes, I think Broadway probably has the most demanding path, but gradually, I think people will be more comfortable that they're safe in those kind of closed spaces, right? And the vibe of the city feels much different to me than it did a few months ago. And so I think I think New York will be back. New York's doom has been predicted many times.
Historically, epidemics and other catastrophes have been catalysts for progress in cities. That could be one of the legacies of COVID-19 as well.
With the vaccine, of course, there's hope, you know. In my belief, like the international tourists will start to come maybe in December. We are hoping something for Christmas. And then it will continue, hopefully, little by little. And it's so important that we have all the people back in Times Square. I mean, New York has to be alive again, you know. And we're going to come back strong, strong, way better, I think. Way better than how it used to be.